Welcome back to Chess Dog. My name is John. Perhaps you have seen Gotham Chess's recent video titled I Quit, where he plays a game against a young master, an 11-year-old master named Ryo Chen, the highest rated 11-year-old in the United States of America. I'd like to talk about a little bit what happened in that game and a little bit of the fallout of it. A couple of things. First of all, I know Ryo. He is a friend. His family is a friend of mine and my wife, and I root for him. I myself have played him 6 times in tournament chess, and the first 3 games we played, I lost. The next 2 I won, and then we had a draw. And the games I lost early on went very much like this game. Basically, I got an advantage out of the opening, was pressing, miscalculated, and lost. And one thing I learned when playing Ryo, as strong as he is, and he's even stronger now, those were right before the pandemic. One thing I learned was you have to calculate very tightly. You know, there's no room for error. You really have to calculate accurately when you're playing him. There are certain times you can get an edge, but getting an advantage isn't enough. You really have to calculate. And Gotham was pretty despondent. I've never met Gotham. But you know, he's sort of the leader of the YouTube chess community. You know, we all love him, and he's really great. And I hope he continues to pursue the Grandmaster title. And I hope he doesn't get too down because of this game. He had the white pieces. He began with d4, knight f6, c4, g6. Ryo is pretty loyal to the King's Indian defense. Knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6, and f4. Gotham decides to play the 4 pawns attack. I play the King's Indian myself, and I've always thought the 4 pawns was a very, very good system against the King's Indian. It's really, really dangerous for black. I don't see it that often. I think one of the reasons why players of the white pieces don't use it that much is because they think they can get an advantage with a more safe line, and they're probably right. The one thing about this opening is if white makes a mistake, white can lose just as quickly as black can. So it's a little risky and aggressive, but it's a good line. Castles, knight f3. White has a clamp on that e5 square, which is the traditional move black would like to play. As it turns out, black can actually get away with playing e5 here. It's not the best, but you can do it for tactical reasons. We won't get into that. Black plays c5, the standard idea, d5. And in these Benoni structures, this becomes a Benoni structure, black has to play e6 to challenge that center. Otherwise, black will just get suffocated by their disadvantage in space. And Gotham played the semi-sideline, pawn takes pawn, and Ryo plays pawn takes pawn, which is definitely the only correct move here. And bishop to d3 and knight to c6. And Gotham castles. So in this position, by the way, if you're curious, the best move for black in this position is almost certainly to play b6. It definitely has the highest winning percentage. And the idea is you just want to get that bishop on c8, on b7 as quickly as you possibly can. We see later in the game black trying to do this, but it's a good idea to just go ahead and do it right now. Ryo plays e5, so we see a bit of an inaccuracy in his opening play. And this happens occasionally with Ryo. When Ryo gets his opening play completely hammered out, he may already be close to playing at Grandmaster level even now. I mean, he's a tremendously talented young player. And Gotham plays f5. And the basic idea here, this is sort of a simple attacking process. The ideas are you can play queen e1, h4, maybe play the bishop at c1 to g5 or h6. The knight at f3 can go to g5. We see this sometimes in a Grand Prix attack in a Sicilian, and it's really a very hard attack for black to deal with. Black plays knight to d4. It's hard to capture that knight because it gives black a protected passed pawn. Bishop to g5, piling on that knight on f6, pinning it. And now all kinds of threats. The knight can go to d5, the queen can go e1, h4, the rook at f1 has x-ray pressure. It's not direct yet, it's blocked, but it could become a problem later. So Ryo, anticipating all of these threats, decides to just get rid of that bishop right now. Plays h6, bishop f6, bishop f6. and white plays the knight to d5, a very nice square. And black has to do something about that knight. And the next move I considered in some ways to be the hardest move to find in the entire game. The two hardest moves to play in chess usually are long moves, where you have to move from one side of the board all the way to the other side of the board, or backwards moves, where you're literally undoing a move you've already done. You don't want to, play the move backwards. You've already moved it forwards. Well, in this position, a backwards move is the best move, and Ryo plays it. Knight goes back to c6. Very hard move to find. Gotham plays queen to e1, shifting that king over to the king side. gf5, ef5, and now that square at e4 can become a pivot point for white's pieces in the attack. Now knight to e7, challenging that knight at d5. The knight just simply cannot be allowed to stay on that square. Gotham played knight to f6 check. Another good idea, I think he addressed this in his video, queen to g3 check. Also leads to some good ideas. A sample line is king to h8, queen to h3, threatening the pawn at h6. And if king to h7, knight to f6 check, rook takes f6, knight g5, king g7, knight e6 check. The knight has to be captured because it's threatening the queen. b6, and after knight g6, just bishop g6, king g6, rook f6, queen f6, and rook f1. And now black just has to deal with that queen and rook, and it's just too much. If queen e7, something like queen to g4, check. If he blocks, then queen to e4 is the end of the game. The king either moves back and rook f7 check, or king to h5 and rook f5 pins the queen. Or he plays back to h7 and rook f7 check, gets the queen for the rook. So queen to g3 check was a pretty good idea. Gotham plays knight to f6, rook f6, and g4. Wants to pawn storm on the king side. Ryo plays b5, also a very good move. He wants to play that bishop to b7 as quickly as he possibly can. Gotham plays queen to h4. Another idea, probably a little bit better, was to actually go ahead and play bishop e4 himself first. And in that way, he can neutralize that bishop on the long diagonal. He's threatening the rook, and after rook b8, queen to h4. Now, if bishop to b7, white can just take the bishop and neutralize the pressure from that bishop. So that might have been a good move to sort of interpose before playing queen to h4 as he did in the game. Queen to f8, knight to d2. He wants to use that e4 square as a pivot point, play knight e4, threaten the rook at f6, etc. Queen to g7, knight e4, and now rook to f5. The pawn can't take the rook because it's pinned by the queen. That was the idea behind g7. And the computer, and Gotham mentions this in the video, recommends h3. And again, that's a very hard move to find because you've been playing a sequence of forcing moves, and all of a sudden taking time out just to defend a pawn doesn't feel right, doesn't feel natural. You want to keep making forcing moves. So it's a hard move to find. Gotham played knight to f6 check. Now, white is still a little better here. He doesn't have the advantage that he had earlier in the game, but, he's still a little bit better in this position. Black plays king to h8, knight to e8, attacks the queen at g7, and the queen goes to g5. Gotham plays queen to g3, but maybe a slightly better way to handle it would be queen to g5, rook to f8 check, blocking, takes rook to f1, and black cannot take the pawn at g4 because knight to f6 check would fork. So after something like rook to b8, trying to activate on the b file, knight takes d6, and white's still a little bit better in that position. Gotham instead plays queen to g3, rook to f4. The rook is threatening to take the pawn at g4 and pin the queen to the king. Gotham plays knight to d6. I don't know if he had mentioned this in the game, but the reason black cannot play rook to g4 in this position is because of knight to f7 check. Forks the king and the queen after king g7, knight g5. White is winning. Rook g3, pawn takes, and this position is completely winning for white. White is up a rook for a knight, but the computers give white like +6 or something. I mean, there's just no way black can win that position. So Ryo plays bishop to e6, a good move, the best move. And Gotham has to defend the pawn at g4 now. Pawn takes, knight e4 hitting the queen, queen to g6, and bishop to c2. Now, this is a key moment. In Gotham's video, he really passes over the variations here real quickly. He doesn't cover a lot of them. And you can tell he's already kind of depressed with how the game has gone. But there is actually a variation not mentioned that can save this position for white. Now, when Gotham presents his videos while he's in a tournament, he's very fresh. Like he just finished the game. He's looking at the computer analysis while he's doing the video. So he doesn't have access to this information the way we do later. Black plays rook to e4. Now you'll notice that rook is pinned to the queen, but there's another kind of pin that can show up in this position. If white plays the queen to g2, then the rook at e4 is actually pinned to the rook at a8. So there's sort of a crisscross pinning threat that exists in this position. There's only one problem. If white plays queen to g2 in this position, black plays bishop to d5, neutralizes that pin against the rook at a8, and sets up a discovery, and black is completely winning in this position. So what does our Silicon friend say? Rook a to d1. That's the move that does the trick, controlling that d5 square. The threat, let's give a passive move by black so we can see the threat. Let's just say he plays a6. The threat is bishop takes e4, queen takes e4, rook f to e1. And the alignment of those pieces on the e-file for black is very unfortunate. After queen to g6, queen to e5 check wins the bishop at e6. There's a check and a double attack on e6. If instead black plays, say, I'm going to lose a minor piece anyway, plays knight to e5 to try to do something with the position, then rook e4, knight g3, rook e5 hitting the bishop, and when the bishop moves, king to h2. And every single square the knight can move to is covered. The knight would be captured, and white would be better in that position. So instead, what black would have to do is play bishop to d5 here. Then white gives up the exchange. Knight takes, now queen to g2. So you have a pin going both directions with that knight at d5. Black can play knight e3, counterattacking the queen at g2. But after queen e4, bishop e4, the knight attacks the rook at f1, but white's bishop attacks the rook at a8. And this is an equal endgame. If instead the knight goes back to f6 to try to defend the rook, bishop e4, knight e4, and rook e1. And now the pin along that diagonal towards the rook at a8 helps white. Rook e8 takes, and this is another equal endgame. So this move, and that's the kind of move, this rook a to d1 move is the kind of move you'd expect maybe a super grandmaster to see. But anybody below that, you would never expect, never expect them to see that move. So he plays bishop to e4, queen e4, and then at this point, black is in control and stays in control for the rest of the game. Rook a e1, queen d4, king h2, knight g6. He kicks the queen around a little bit, and queens come off the board, and those two minor pieces and those pawns are just too strong. Rook d6, bishop f7 to defend, rook e2, rook d4. White can't take the rook, giving black a huge mass of pawns in the center. Rook a6, rook to d7, rook c6 attacking the c5 pawn, king g7, rook c5, knight f4, rook c2, knight d3, rook b5, e4. The passed pawn begins to advance. b3, e3, bc4, rook to e7. And as we all know the rule in rook endgames, rooks belong behind passed pawns. And that's true of whether it's your passed pawn or your opponent's passed pawn. You put it behind the passed pawn. He tries to blockade with the rook. Bishop takes c4. Rook to b1. Knight f4 hitting the rook. Rook e to e1. Now e2. Rook to b2. and king to f7. He defends this rook with his king, which becomes important in the tactic here. King g3, knight to d3. Then when rook e2 is played, knight takes b2. And the rook at e7, since it's protected by the king, he can't capture it. Rook takes knight. Rook e3 check, king f4, rook a3. And he defends the pawn at a7 and attacks the pawn at a2. And Gotham resigned in this position. So it was a tough game, but I think I speak for all of us when I say that we hope Gotham continues. It's just one game, and he definitely was playing a genius, and it was a great game to see. And I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you again soon at Chess Dog. Talk to you again. Bye.